Hello, webinar attendees. My name is Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Just a side note, I am in quarantine right now, so you will see me in my nephew's bedroom. My son recently tested positive for COVID. Thankfully, he's okay, but we are all quarantining, and such is the reality of these times. But I still get to do this great webinar with y'all. So we hope that you and your families and communities are staying healthy and taking care of one another during these times. And we're going to begin with an land acknowledgement. So as a step towards honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation, Campus Compact seeks to acknowledge the traditional native lands on which we stand. Given that we are gathering for today's webinar from across the country and some from around the globe, we invite you to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Native people where you are joining us from. And you can add those to the chat. I myself am participating from Chicago, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, also called this area home. And this region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. Today, as one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States, resides in Chicago, and members of this community continue to contribute to the life of this city and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways. We also want to recognize and stand in solidarity with those individuals who are continuing to call for racial justice and equitable communities and affirm that Black Lives Matter. We commit to move beyond words into programs and actions that fully embody a commitment to full participation and equity. We're so excited to have you be part of our webinar today titled "The Arc of Citizenship Bends Towards Justice When We Work Alongside Communities." That's something that we truly believe in and excited to learn more about. But before I introduce our presenters, I just want to plug a few things. One is that we have been hosting our second round of the Fusion course, which is enhancing online education through community-based learning. The final kind of set of classes for this round are taking place January 4th through 14th. So if you're interested, there's still opportunities to sign up. You can look that up on our compact.org website if you do a search for Fusion. And this training, this course provides critical training and support to faculty as they adapt to online teaching with community engagement. The other piece is we're entering our 5th season of our Compact Nation podcast, so I invite you all to check that out on any of your favorite podcast listening apps. So now let me introduce our presenters. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Cara Whaley, who is Associate Director of the James Madison Center for Civic Engagement, where she works in partnership with students, faculty, staff, and community partners to embed civic learning and democratic engagement across campus through curricular and co-curricular programming. Cara has developed innovative pedagogy, melding scholarship and experiential learning to teach courses on civic engagement, campaigns and elections, and state and local politics. At the heart of her research interest is a desire to understand and illuminate how the interactions of political actors and institutions structure public access and participation in policy and decision-making. Her dissertation explored the politics of cleaning up the environmental contamination that resulted from the testing, development, and production of nuclear weapons, with a focus on the role of community-based groups in developing expertise and engaging the public in policy. And given it's 2020, Cara was also busy with things like the census and elections, and she'll talk more about that. Next, I'd like to introduce Joe Benjamin, who's the coordinator of community impact at United Way, Harrisonburg, and Rockingham County. Joe previously worked with international students at James Madison University and served on multiple committees and working groups for diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives at the university. She has also worked with animals at the local SPCA, animal shelter, and in various wildlife and domestic animal rescue organizations. Joe has special interest in work surrounding LGBTQ identities, disability inclusion, language access, and the intersectionality of multiple identities. So welcome to our presenters, and I will let you get started.
Thank you so much, Marisol, and I'm so sorry about your son, and I hope he is feeling well soon and that the rest of the family stays safe. We are going to share our screen for this presentation, and we can make these absolutely available because there are some links within the presentation that we'll share. So first, if you we'd just love to ask you all if you would share in the chat function your name, your pronouns, the institution that you're with, and then also why you joined this webinar. And then one other thing, we're going to ask you to share one word that describes the state of student engagement in social justice efforts on your campus. Sorry. Okay, it looks like the messages might only be able to be seen by panelists. So I can just share some of the words that are coming in, and Joe, feel free to also share what you see as well. So it looks like, thank you all so much for joining us and for your great contributions. We're seeing in terms of student engagement and social justice, words like growing, one-sided is a word that's has been used.
I see
Hopeful.
Evolving. Yeah, evolving and woke. Very confidently woke there.
Limited. Enthusiastic. Strong.
Resourceful. Mm-hmm. Intentional. Impassioned. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Joe. Efforts are very strong at IUPUI in a campus, but in a small group of students. I think we see that very similarly at JMU as well.
Ooh, I see someone involved in a community veterinary medicine initiative. That will be relevant here. I've got pictures of, I think, 2 cute dogs on a slide.
More impassioned, involved, slow to adapt in the field. Yes, I think there's oftentimes a lot of frustration, and that often this work is more reactive than proactive, and it's been difficult to get out in front. Limited is another word that's been used. Social justice and activism have been diminished. Yes, I think that's That's also something that I hope that we can maybe address in this, because we have also seen sort of as the news has faded away from being at the forefront, and especially post-election, we're also seeing activism die down on campus. Another word that was used was fragmented. Thank you all so much. I'm not sure, we'll see if we can adjust the settings because we'll be using the chat. Marisol, I'm not sure if that's something that you can help us with, so that way everybody can see each other's responses. Mm-hmm. Evolving and slowing is evolving slowly, another word that was just added. So what we're going to walk through today is what we have been grappling with here at James Madison University and here in the Shenandoah Valley, and going over some of the ways that we have been trying to identify the challenges and locating the solutions. We're going to talk about primarily from our experiences and also in conjunction with some of the scholarships, some strategies for building relationships with community partners in order to make progress and move forward. We're also going to offer some ideas for developing ideas for partnering with local organizations to address contemporary social justice issues in your communities by focusing on place-based and experiential learning, which is the primary focus of our programs, teaching and learning efforts, and in our partnerships, and some of the things that we will both share. And then we'll have time for questions and answers. Okay, the chat should be open up to everyone now. So let's, if somebody wants to try posting, that would be great. We'll see if we can all see it. Make sure you're just set to all panelists and all attendees. See if that is an option for you in the chat function. Next up, Marisol is going to help us by posting a poll for you all with 4 quick questions. And you'll see on the last, on question number 3, that one of the, in terms of challenges that you face, if you don't see one that we listed, please feel free to type some of those challenges using the chat function. And now we can all see each other's responses as well. Thank you, Marissa. That should have been one we included. That is definitely a huge challenge from the faculty perspective, especially. Okay, so here are the poll results. We're going to scroll, I'm going to scroll down and look at, it looks like the majority of campuses and organizations represented on this webinar do have equity and inclusion initiatives, so that's fantastic. And so I think that's great to know. I think one of the challenges we might be able to talk about then is the question of centralization versus decentralization, and what role those initiatives can play in coordinating efforts. And in bringing together coalitions of both campus partners and community partners. In terms of challenges, looking at the results, A majority responded that lack of understanding of community needs and issues was by far the largest challenge. And
Mm-hmm.
a few others trailing behind.
Yeah.
Go
No
ahead, Joe.
challenges or partnerships are always successful. No one at all. I hope we'd be able to identify some experts out there. But yeah, that seems like a fair spread.
I just want to share, you'll see in the chat, in addition to the lack of rewards and structures for faculty. So for example, including DEI work and community engagement, civic engagement as part of the promotion and tenure process is a huge challenge. And that is, I think we find that can be really difficult because every university is different, and there's questions. I know where we are. There's been reluctance to make it a top-down directive to include that in promotion and promotion and tenure, because the thought is that should really be left to the academic units, and so there's a little bit of there are these questions of, well, how might we then incentivize academic unit heads to incorporate such incentives, and those are sort of left to the departments. And I think what we see is that, the departments that are already inclined towards this kind of work do include it and promote it, but then we find, fields where we probably need this work to be occurring a little bit more are the ones that aren't necessarily including that in promotion and tenure. And so it just exacerbates those inequities. Another challenge that Jesse shared was the disparate resources and this sort of lack of institutional outcomes and goals, but that it's a priority for their new president. And I know I can say that I've only been at JMU. This is my third year. I'm in almost the middle of my third year at JMU. But hearing the stories, that from President Alger coming in 2014, and leading this as leading engagement and wanting to become the engaged university and making it a priority after having done a listening tour of faculty, staff, students, and alumni, and creating the vision and mission, that has really helped. And I know that is something that as a Center for Civic Engagement, we really rely on. And so hopefully that will help in terms of institutional outcomes and goals. I would also say it also helps with assessment, right? So being able to show what we're doing and measure impact against our vision markers and our goals. And then that can also help with incentivizing departments to be on board with a university-wide vision and mission. So let me just share a little bit about how we are thinking. The James Madison Center for Civic Engagement, I just want to say, we're still a pretty new entity, and we are continuing to learn, and we absolutely do not have all of the answers. And I look forward to hearing as much as possible from the chat what you all are doing. So please do share your experiences as we go along here, and your ideas, and also your questions. I want to say that one of the things that we did right at the beginning was to create civic learning outcomes, and that has been really useful in thinking about our program design, so that we can assess and measure what we're doing. But there's a set of questions that we also ask ourselves now that we have a strategic vision and a strategic plan, as we are designing programming. And I think we are, as part of our strategic planning process, we were very intentional in making sure that we had equity and inclusion as part of our institutional values. And I think just as important, we included in our values the idea of being willing to challenge the status quo, because I think those do go hand in hand. And we do not see the work, even though we do have an Office for Access and Inclusion at JMU, we do not see the work of civic engagement as separate from diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And in fact, believe that they absolutely cannot be, because it would only exacerbate existing inequity, socioeconomic, and political inequities that we already have, and I think that's particularly the case where we are situated at a predominantly white and historically white institution. So when we are thinking about programming and design and what we're going to come up with, we are thinking about how our programming can work specifically towards redressing the inequities between our institution and the communities in which we are situated. We are also trying to think about who should be brought into the programming, who should be centered, so that it will uplift traditionally marginalized and minoritized voices. We also want to think about how our programs challenge existing systems of power. And here specifically, and I think this might differentiate our Center for Civic Engagement a little bit from just community service learning or volunteerism, in that we are thinking very much about the role of policy and the importance of structural changes to the system, and how we can work alongside community partners with students in challenging those systems and structures of power. We're also, constantly questioning what constitutes a community need. I have found in academia, I worked for 9 years in the nonprofit world before I went back to graduate school. And one of the things that I have found in academia is that we often tend to come with a preset solution, and we think we have the solution for the community without having a good understanding of needs. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I also see that a lot with students who, think that they have a solution without really understanding what the needs are in the community. We also are thinking very deeply about how we can make our partnerships more equitable. And for that, I think, there are two things that we have focused on that we'll talk about. The first is making sure that we're working in coalitions, reaching out across campus to include the appropriate faculty, staff, students, but also within our communities and our region. And then the other, I think really important issue for us is making sure that we're compensating community partners for their role, particularly when they're working with us and educating students. Sometimes as a faculty, I might be, volunteering my time as service to a community partner. So I'm not talking about, paying a community partner in that case, but particularly we'll talk about some experiential learning opportunities in which, our community partners are either lecturing or, they're training our students. And we really need to emphasize the importance of compensating them, and also making sure, along with that compensation, making sure that they have opportunities to share, to be co-published with us, to share their research, to share their findings, to co-present with us as well. The next thing that we are really focused on with regards to our programming is the idea that students should be co-creators and co-implementers. Do they have an opportunity to come up with ideas to co-implement the plans that are created? This is especially helpful when we're thinking about our census work this year and voter engagement work, but there are also ideas that for community innovations and thinking about addressing problems where students are focused much more on addressing problems themselves, particularly through participating in policy and decision-making processes, and actually implementing the plans that they come up with. So not just writing up a report of their observations, but also being part of the solution to the challenges that we find and see. And then finally, we're thinking about assessing our programs for impact. And for us, that goes back to our civic learning and to our civic learning outcomes, which I'd be happy to share, but it's also available on our website under our assessment tab at jmu.edu/civic. Joe, I feel like I've been talking a lot in a row. Do you want to jump in before I go on to the next slide and add anything?
No, you are good. I'm definitely, I am actually benefiting a lot from doing this with you, but I will just point out for the attendees to know that my role at United Way is as a community partner here, but in my former life, my previous role was working at JMU, and so I was working directly with students who were engaged in these types of partnerships from their side, but I've also seen it from the community partner side at United Way, but also through work at the SPCA as well. So no, I will definitely chime in as we go along, but I do feel like there are multiple different perspectives to bring in, and I'm happy to be here to bring in mine as well.
So thank you, Joe. And Joe does have her own slides too. I just realized I was talking a lot.
You're saying good things, so keep going.
So I want to talk, I thought I would highlight a couple of examples, and I am going to talk pre-pandemic and post-pandemic because we have lived in very different worlds and spaces this year, and we of course all had to adjust. But I thought I would just give some examples of how we've incorporated our values of equity and inclusion and partnering with our community partners and bringing students in as co-creators through some specific initiatives that we did just this year. So I think one of the let me go back and just say, I think before I say how we got to this programming, one of the things that, we are assessing each semester is, what are the biggest challenges that the community is facing, and how can we be involved? So the first question is, what are the biggest challenges and what is it that we can bring to the table within the context of work that's already being done. And so I think one of the things that we like to do is look and see who else is already doing that work or who is interested in doing that work. And that is really part of the value of working in coalitions, is that we can, bring our own sets of expertise, skills, resources, and capacity to the table, and then work alongside each other to increase the collective capacity of our communities. And so we're really thinking about how we can work together on some of these issues. For 2020, we had specifically identified in 2019 that the 2020 census was going to be a priority. This had, sort of multiple layers of implications. I think, as you all know, the importance of the census for political representation and also for the distribution of resources. And so it was very clear, we live, where we are situated in the Shenandoah Valley. There are 57 languages spoken in our public schools. We are a large, we have a large immigrant and refugee population. We are a refugee resettlement community. And then we have several institutions of higher education, of which JMU is one. And so all of those populations are considered hard to count, hard to reach. And so that really, we had identified that in 2019 and began working in 2019 on the 2020 census. Actually, we began work in December of 2018 on the 2020 census. And so it was also clear, from local officials, that this was going to be something that we really need to focus on. We're also in a rural area of the state, so that mattered because of issues facing rural communities related to broadband, related to political representation, and the redistricting that's going to follow. So we found that the census was a great thing to work on because there was also a broad base of support from across the political spectrum, despite what may have been happening at the national level. However, the national level also complicated, and specifically the Trump administration complicated our efforts on the 2020 census. And we can talk more about that in Q&A, but particularly for our populations with students and with immigrants and refugees, that became more challenging. So for the 2020 census, we worked in partnership with a coalition. It included nonprofit organizations, including United Way, but also city and county officials. It included our public schools, both our city and county public schools, all of our surrounding representatives from all of our surrounding localities, our chambers of commerce. I think what was really important about this was because we were working in a coalition and complementing each other, we could really identify needs and rapidly retool when the pandemic hit. And we also sort of created an infrastructure for working together that will last beyond just this census, and can be reused into the next, into the 2030 census. So as the census was happening and as the pandemic was happening, we already had equity and inclusion in our strategic plan before the police killing of George Floyd, but it also became very clear to us as protests and as the nation began to grapple, on a broader scale this year with our racist history, and especially our anti-Black racist history, that we needed to respond. And again, here, all of these are links, and these slides will be shared, so you can, all of our information and resources are archived on these links. But we approached anti-racism and social justice from a couple of different ways, focused on providing community forums that were online, through Facebook Live, and bringing together different voices, and then providing resources for faculty and staff, and workshops for faculty and staff that uplifted. So we were just facilitators, and we tried to emphasize the expertise that we had, and partnered with a whole wide range of campus expertise from our Center for Faculty Innovation, our Access and Inclusion Initiative, and also with community partners. And Joe might want to say something too about your all's focus on that, and as well. I don't know if you want to say that here or later, with changes in annual community service days.
Yes, yeah, I can mention it here. I mean, we did have, so I started at United Way in August this year, and so a lot of changes were made over the summer, just in terms of ways that we operate related to the pandemic, but also just a more a more strategic focus on equity work within United Way as well. So there's an annual event, Day of Caring, that is usually in person and provides lots of opportunities for folks in the community to engage in just community service work around the area. It's also a time when a lot of students might engage in community service work, but because of the pandemic this year, it was largely online. We did some online workshops, and we're able to have some in-person project sites as well. But we wanted to incorporate a specific focus on equity, not only in our workshops, but just in the work that we do at United Way as well. So we've revamped our grant process to make it more accessible to local organizations to be able to access our funding in terms of just the amount of time it would take to complete our application, and trying to make sure that the funds that are donated to United Way are shared in an equitable way within community organizations, and bringing with that expectation that community partners that benefit from our funding will engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and specifically naming an equity audit as one of the steps that they'll take during the funding cycle as sort of a step in the direction of just more mindful work that we're doing in the community to address largely health disparities that come from inequities that exist just in systems that we live in locally. So I can talk more about that later as well, but that's just a brief intro.
And so moving into the fall, again, we had elections, and that you obviously we had elections this fall, and that became a huge locus of attention for us. Our voter education and engagement plans included partnering again with the city and the county. And so students emphasized, poll workers had been identified as something that we needed at the state level, also nationally. One of our students singularly recruited 120 students to serve as first-time poll workers, primarily in Harrisonburg and Rockingham, but also across the Commonwealth of Virginia. And to try to fill that need that had been identified. And students were heavily involved in the creation of our voter engagement and education plan. And then alongside community partners and elected officials, our Board of Elections, our Director of Elections, so a couple of Directors of Elections implemented that plan, again, with an emphasis on the youth voter turnout, but also, one of our goals was to reduce the inequities that we have seen, or gaps in participation that we see across race and ethnicity. And so that was also a big focus of our plans. And I taught a course on the 2020 elections where students had the opportunity to engage in experiential learning, tying experiential learning around the elections to political science theory and scholarship, alongside with media arts and design, because that was very much needed as we turned into the virtual world. And then two other quick programs that I want to highlight. There is an initiative called Global Climate Change Week that is really meant to engage academics within their communities around climate change and climate justice. And so we, one of our faculty members in justice studies, Case Watkins, spearheaded this initiative, and we just helped facilitate this initiative. But we focused on a local partnership in our community. It's called the 50 by 25 campaign to get 50% renewable energy adopted in our locality by the 2025, again, because it's an equity issue, and because that campaign also highlights and centers those who are most affected by climate change, including locally. And we also highlighted activists from Indigenous tribes who have been working on climate change, and did a community forum that had a virtual program with over 300 people who joined us from the Shenandoah Valley. And so that was actually quite an impactful, despite having to be virtual. I don't have a webpage up yet on our immigration programming, but that is also one additional area of focus, again, because we are an area that has high immigration and refugee resettlement. The lower picture in this slide is from our February workshop, right before the early February, before we were shut down. So that is why there are people gathered and no masks and not socially distanced because it was pre-pandemic. we'll be able to resume this work that we have been doing. This has been led by professors in communication, Drs. Carlos and Melissa Aleman, and with the Scholars Latino Initiative. And if you squint, you'll see that those are some of our student democracy fellows up on the stage leading this workshop. But this is about providing a workshop space for folks in our community to come learn how to share their immigration experience and to create story maps to share that experience. We also tied the workshop to census participation, to voter registration and elections ahead of the primaries and caucuses in the spring. And we're looking forward to resuming that specific program. But the idea is to ensure that community members can share their stories on their own terms, and that we can better acknowledge their experiences and be able to share and learn from them. And then we've also, our immigration programming has done some more this fall, primarily virtually. It's been much more difficult. I think that has been one of our challenges in the pandemic that I'm sure many of you all have also faced in terms of being, quote unquote, being in the community when we have public health guidelines that we really need to follow that can create barriers and physical restrictions. Many of our students in K-12 are facing many challenges because of virtual learning, and it's much harder for us to connect with them and bring them into programs like the immigrant narrative, transforming the narrative workshops, because it's right now we're in survival. They're in survival mode. And so when things calm down a bit, and so we've been trying to think of other ways, to bring programming. And so a lot of it has focused more internally on just educating JMU students about the immigrant communities more broadly through social media. I recognize as I'm droning on that we all face Zoom fatigue. And so that has been a big challenge, I think, for all of us in the pandemic. A challenge for coordinating amongst our coalitions and doing this work. But there have also been a lot of positives, particularly around our anti-racism and social justice work, in that we have found that in this virtual space, by creating spaces in Zoom and Facebook Live discussions, taking on these issues and talking about them directly, we've actually seen tremendous participation. So since the pandemic hit, we've done 55 virtual programs that have reached over 260,000 people. And so I think as a new center, we're kind of proud of that, that we were able to use this new space to try to continue to bring people together, but we're constantly reassessing that because it can be because everybody is feeling the fatigue of being online and not being able to make that in-person connections. Another thing here is a picture of Mari, with the census. We found that because of the fatigue that people were facing in our community, that not everybody is, tuning into social media. There's a lot of noise on social media. The online environment is much noisier than usual, in addition to this attention deficit economy that we have. And so one of the things we did was to do several get out the count canvases with information about the census in English and Spanish. And that was something that, had been a community identified need. So the city told us, we're not getting enough play on our social media. What can we do? And through our coalition, we came up with this idea, okay, we can do door hangers, we can leave it behind safely, and try to reach people that way. And so our students did that alongside public safety officers, and high school students were able to get involved. So it gave people something to do to address this pressing need that we had. And so I just highly encourage folks to, again, look for those things. I think, not if we had not been working in a coalition, and hearing and being able to exchange information between all of our various partners, we wouldn't have been able to, kind of figure out different ways of getting the information out. In addition to the door hangers, one of the other things we made use of this last year, for political participation and census participation, was meal pickups. So even though we were in virtual school, families were still coming to pick up meals. And so our students and faculty created educational materials and an art contest around the census, and distributed, partnered with our school districts. We got them the materials, and then they helped distribute through the meals distribution program. So that was another, again, if we hadn't been working together to identify, where we could reach people, we would have missed a lot of folks. And then also the art contest was great because it gave students the opportunity to do something and learn about the census while they were at home in the spring. I'll just say, I know that virtual is not the answer to all of the issues, but I do think, that constantly listening and engaging and showing up in the community and not expecting the community to come to us on campus is really important. I think this was mentioned in somebody's comments. One of the things that we found is that because our university is so large, it can be intimidating, and community partners don't always know what the access points are.
I will talk very briefly just to give a few examples of different campus community partnerships. I'll probably just gloss over this slide and then spend a little bit more time on the next one. But I mentioned briefly in my previous role at the Harrisonburg SPCA, I served as the adoption, rescue, and foster coordinator. So working in a local nonprofit, I was wearing many different hats and having connections at JMU. I partnered with a Justice Studies senior capstone course. There's some faculty there who I was connected with still, and so they volunteered some students to help with a project. We partnered on a sort of a research project to do some data gathering, and actually partner with Case Watkins, as you mentioned there, about a GIS mapping program just to help kind of understand the issues and solutions related to challenges of pet ownership. And by that, I'm really referring to spays and neuters and just preventative vet care in the local area. It's a kind of an issue that lots of people love the cute and cuddly animals, but to think through upstream solutions to problems of animal shelters would be really beneficial, and something that a lot of animal shelters really don't have time to stop and do. And so using those students to actually go out, they went out to different locations around our local city and county to kind of gather some firsthand accounts from pet owners to find out what are the barriers to getting animals to the vet. Is it just socioeconomic in terms of class differences and not having the funds to be able to afford a vet? Or is it transportation to get there? Is it access to vet offices and where they're located around our area? Or is it just cultural understandings about what you do with pets? We have a very agricultural community locally, and so there is a perception that some animals are not meant to be spayed and neutered, and so there's a educational learning curve, but there's also kind of a financial barrier to overcome. So those students did a lot of work to kind of help us understand the issue a bit better, and I was able to pull some data from the SPCA's records in terms of animals that were being taken in terms of owner surrenders or strays that were found, and map where there were pockets of animals that were in need of spaying and neutering, and try to target some education and resources in those areas to try to help combat just the pet overpopulation problem that plagues our local area as well as others as well. If you want to go to the next slide, Kara, I'll focus a little bit more on that one. The campus community partnerships that we've engaged in now that I work at United Way, we have a partnership with an X-Labs course. It's an interdisciplinary course for undergraduate and graduate students. And so there is a combination of various different majors as well as just kind of experience levels in higher education. The students broke up into teams and focused on some different areas, specifically surrounding food, housing, transportation, governance, and a few other areas. But they applied a design thinking process to propose some solutions to community problems. And what I noticed in working with one group, I sat through some presentations to hear their ideas at a preliminary stage. And it was very clear that these students were maybe Googling and doing some research in the library and had either never set foot off campus or had not entered the parts of the community where the work that they were proposing to carry out would be impacting. And so I live in a part of Harrisonburg that's known as the Northeast neighborhood of Harrisonburg, and it is a place where there is a great deal of diversity. And the students were under the perception that it was where there was a great deal of poverty, and there is sort of a destitute population that is in great need, and that may be the case for very specific people who live in the neighborhood, but it's also an area that there's been a lot of effort to kind of revitalize, and there's a strong neighborhood kind of identity in the Northeast neighborhood as well. There are historical roots of racism in our community, as there are in many places around the US, but the Northeast neighborhood was changed greatly in the 1950s and 60s because of urban renewal projects. And so there were federal grants that were made to redevelop land in downtown spaces. And so there were actual neighborhoods where people lived, mainly people of color, mainly Black people in the Northeast neighborhood, and their homes were basically taken to create parking lots and retail space that would be more profitable and bring business into downtown Harrisonburg. And so there's this history of land use in the Northeast neighborhood that is really at the root of a lot of the disparity that exists in this community. And so I invited the students to actually join me on a walk around my neighborhood, and I met them on the front steps of a school, the Sims Center in Harrisonburg, that was actually a segregated school back in the day. And so there were lots of just lessons to be learned about being physically in that space and thinking about the community garden that exists there as one step in the direction of trying to kind of address community concerns around food insecurity. So we had a rich conversation, and it was something that I feel like was, it got them out of the classroom and it got them more connected with the actual sort of community that they were proposing these hypothetical ideas of work to be done, and actually saw that there were people living in that neighborhood, and I introduced them to my neighbors and talked about different sort of initiatives that are going on. So it was a way that I connected with them directly, but it was also just a beneficial way for me as a community partner working at United Way to know that students were sort of getting that information into the conversations that they were having within the classroom. If you want to go on to the next slide, we can skip over design thinking. I think we're about 8 minutes to the end. If you want to go with that, I'll jump in with some input, Kara, if you want to keep going.
I muted myself because I should cede the rest of my time to you.
Oh, you're fine. I mean, yeah, I'm happy to keep talking, but I do like the things that
I'm just going to say very briefly, I'm just going to emphasize this first point, just to, as faculty, as staff at the university, we should be asking community partners what needs they have, and then designing our syllabi or programs around addressing those needs.
Mm-hmm. I think just from the community partners perspective, really practically, we have limited time and resources. Everyone does, but when we're working in nonprofits, staff who work in nonprofits often wear multiple hats and have more things to do than there is time to do it to an exponential rate. And so working at the pace of life, we don't operate in terms of semesters. Community partners are working, community organizations are actually on the front lines working with a lot of direct services and addressing needs either trying to fill the gap in services that might exist in terms of just support that's available through programming that's actually designed to support people in need, but also addressing kind of upstream issues in terms of advocacy and advocating for change that would actually have a lasting impact for individuals who might be struggling. We talk a lot about the ALICE population, asset limited, income constrained, employed. If you're familiar with United Way's, there is a research project to kind of pull together data to paint the picture of what it's like to live between the poverty level and what you would actually need to be able to survive and thrive in the local economy. So we struggle a lot locally with the town gown divide, which I know is a common occurrence with a lot of college towns, but knowing that there's a great perception of insiders and outsiders, and local, I would say some nonprofits, local community partners have a very negative perception of students, and so they do shy away from work and any level that would actually be beneficial. But on the flip side, there are a lot of local community partners, including United Way, that have very strong relationships with students and are able to benefit from the different resources and information that we can glean from our partnerships with them. Yeah, and it's very, in my 4 months here at United Way, it's very much a semester's worth of time that I've spent here, and I am very aware that it takes those sort of team development process steps of the forming, storming, norming, performing to get to a phase of actually doing productive work, and that takes time, and so that's condensed and accelerated for students. And so a lot of times the quality of that partnership, I think, is just really starting to hit the point of productivity and the semester ends. And so ongoing partnerships can be difficult, but when we do have faculty members who are also part of the local community, there's a great potential to continue on in subsequent semesters with student groups who might be working on kind of long-term solutions to problems that exist here. You're welcome to go forward in the slides. Yeah. I think this kind of goes more into just the faculty and students. There are benefits to our partnerships. I spent a bit of time talking about challenges, but yeah, the campus will use a community as its laboratory for students to learn. And there's kind of a transactional relationship that exists there. Kara mentioned earlier about the inequity and the conscientious sort of mindset of wanting to compensate community partners for the time that they're spending with students teaching them, but I will also acknowledge that community partners will take advantage of free labor from students and faculty who are donating their time and energy. And a lot of times students are paying to earn the credits that they are gaining from the course, and they are providing us a service as well. So there is a sort of a transactional piece there that the equity part of it is only achieved through a great level of intention and just acknowledging those dynamics and trying to navigate them together. We are going to share the slides afterward. I am aware we're near the end, and there's lots of other information there that I hope will trigger some conversation and thought amongst you and your campuses or communities. And maybe this is something that can carry forward into the work that you do. Do you want to go forward? I know we've got just a couple minutes here, and we want to leave time for Q&A. So if there are any questions, Lauren, I saw your email address there. I'm happy to reach out and connect with you about the work that we did at the SBCA. But I'm sure there are lots of stories of just campus and community partnerships that have been very successful. And I'm sure the challenges that I mentioned ring true for lots of folks as well. I'll stop for a moment. If anyone does want to drop some questions into the chat, we're happy to answer them. I see there's also a Q&A. There's 2 boxes there, so choose your own adventure, which one you want to drop a question into. Good.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists for your presentation. Thank you to the attendees for coming on and joining us. You will be getting a evaluation in your inbox shortly, so we ask that you fill that out and give us any additional feedback. I have to say I really did appreciate, Cara, the kind of statement around the connection between equity and community engagement, and how they're part and parcel of one another. I think too many times in the field we have separated them, and now it's really that time to come together and for our institutions to look at them in unified ways as well. So thanks for pointing that out. So thank you, Joe. Thank you, Cara. And we will be posting the video of the webinar on the website in about 2 weeks, but we'll send out the slides to folks who registered. Thank you so much and have a beautiful day. Take care.